Good afternoon, Maine. This is Chuck Ellis, and you are watching the Muddy Waters podcast. And as usual, I am your host, your swamp guide, if you will, guiding you through the messy swamp of what is American and Maine politics. The Muddy Waters podcast exists, obviously, to help the people of Maine better understand what's going on here in our state. Today, it's going to be a little different. We're going to talk a little bit about how it relates in America and Maine to a couple other places in the world, namely Canada and New York at this point. But yeah, we try to get people from around the state, individual people, average people, to politicians, to business owners, to medical practitioners, and different people from around our state who understand what's actually going on here in Maine in order to better understand how we need to what we need to do to fix our state, essentially. Like, what's going on, first of all, because mainstream media is failing you, and then what we can do to fix it. We've had a lot of really exciting things happen with particularly most recently with the Girl First rally that happened this last weekend, but there's been a lot of positive momentum around protecting women's sports. And I think that's something that we need to build on. Conversely, there's been a lot of frustration and arguments about like who was involved and who wasn't involved and why they weren't involved. And there's been a lot of conversation. I just think that's like unhelpful to our movement. And so what I would just recommend is like all of our legislators in Augusta that are registered Republicans, for the most part, are fighting for us, and they're working together to fight for us. They're doing different things in different ways. And I would just advocate, let's continue to work together and not get distracted and away from who the real enemy is. I think of, I remember the movie, The Hunger Games, and Katniss, and how the guy, the game maker guy, I can't remember his name, but reminding her, like, remember who the real enemy is. The real enemy is not any of us on our side. It's the global elites and the radical left. And so we need to unite and work together, even if we don't 100% agree and see eye to eye with everybody on our side, because the enemy is dangerous and coordinated and very effective at working together. And so that's just my brief speech on that. I won't go into any more details, but that's what I have to say about that. So today, we're very fortunate to have with us former short time, I would say, Mainer, and we'll call Canadian. So we are getting a little international here. We're going to have a Canadian on the podcast. Justin Baird. Is Baird-y? Is that how you say it?
Baird.
Okay, I thought it was Baird, but when you sent me the message that explained how to pronounce it, it actually confused me a little bit, apparently. So, Justin,
see, I come from Nova Scotia, so it's it's funny, Nova Scotia. Everyone just assumes Baird. They know how to pronounce because everything in the phone book is McLean, McClellan, Baird. So many Scottish names.
Yeah. Well, I would have assumed Baird based on the spelling. Or maybe just because Ryan McMahon, who he's mentioned you before. I didn't actually meet you when you were here in the state of Maine, but I knew that you were around because he had mentioned a bit because you were in the Portland area, his district. So anyway, just thank you so much for coming on and joining and getting into the mud with us, so to speak.
So very happy to be here. I like to say it's 6 degrees because everyone seems to know Ryan, in some sort of way.
Sorry, I missed that. Maybe I glitched, but you might have, your connection might have.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say it's 6 degrees from Ryan because everyone seems to, everyone knows Ryan in some sort of way.
Yeah, he definitely is a good networker. We'll call it grassroots organizer. But he somehow knows a lot of people, but also stays out of the limelight. But we're mentioning him today, which is probably actually, I don't think he cares. But anyway, yeah. So tell us. So obviously you're originally from Canada, and so to some degree, a little bit about, although it's a lot easier in some ways for you than it is for me, but a little bit about, like, I'm trying to bring my wife here. She's in Kenya and having to deal with and go through the USCIS. So tell us a little bit about your story, though. You're here from Canada. What brought you here? And then we'll get into politics a bit later. But yeah, who are you? Where you come from? What brought you here? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that Canada has recently been in the news a lot with the tariffs and whatnot. So I figure, it's in a lot of ways it's a good idea to understand, who are these weird people to the north of us that seem to be coming so often. But for me, at least, I grew up in a small town, sort of a very, small fishing community, very much like Maine in Nova Scotia, and has a lot of the same issues, has a lot of the same benefits, I would say. But grew up, went to school. Very much a Canadian tradition if you live in Nova Scotia to go down to the outlets in Kittery to pick up school supplies and clothes and whatnot. So I'd been coming to the United States for probably 10, 15 years, really just to sort of, engage with the culture. But eventually met my wife. And sort of things went from there. And then, as you mentioned, the USCIS, going through the process of actually, getting married, dealing with the insanity of COVID, and the cross border sort of, problems that come with that. It more than I do to a certain extent. It is truly, insane, completely rip your hair out of your head.
Yeah, it's why I'm going bald. Actually, you can't see it here because the way my wife has me slick my hair back, but I'm going bald as a result of having to go through the USCIS process. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I think liberals argue that we should just let people across the border because the legal immigration process takes too long. That's the argument that they make, and I'm like, well, you're half right. The legal immigration process does take too long for certain circumstances. Other ones, like it takes like people who are seeking asylum the appropriate way. It takes so long because there are so many of them, and there are really only so many people that we can bring into our country effectively in a good way in a year. Over a period of time. Like part of the problem that we're dealing with here in the state of Maine, we've got 75,000. I think we've got somewhere around 75 to 100,000 non-citizen immigrants, whether they're legal, illegal, or other. And we're about 80,000 housing units shy of the number of housing units we need to house the current people that are here. So it's like, in order to be able to bring people in, we need the infrastructure. And so, like when we're talking about illegal, so when we're talking about immigration in certain circumstances, we have to take into account how that impacts our society, obviously. But yeah, the legal immigration process, like you're married, I'm married, you're married to a U.S. citizen, I'm married, my wife, we've been waiting. We're at about 19 months, almost 19 months that we've been waiting since we got married. I mean, an end is kind of in sight, but it's hazy. It could be 3 months, it could be 12, it's just wild.
And I was just going to just comment on that. I like to imagine, consider immigration to be like a line at a restaurant, right? You have 100 or so people waiting in line at a restaurant. And if 60 of them are not supposed to be there and are waiting not for a reservation, but just to sort of bum around, if you take those 60 out of the line gets shorter, right? So the way you address, the problems with legal immigration is you crack down on illegal immigration, the people who are not supposed to be here. Again, I believe it's, Title 23, Section 5 of, United States Code. If you do not seek entry at a port of entry to claim asylum, right? That is a crime. You have no legal basis to be. Instead, I'm sure you've thought of the same thing. It might have been just easier to go to Eagle Pass in Texas and just throw your passport in the Rio Grande, and then have the opportunity to come here. You get a court date in 3.5 years. You get a backpack full of essentials given to you by Catholic charities, and you can essentially do whatever it is you choose. And that operates very much still in states like Maine, sort of the pathway. People always talk about a pathway to citizenship. There's a pathway to illegally come into the country and illegally stay here. And it's facilitated by a whole bunch of organizations.
Yeah, a whole bunch of organizations that has been by a number of different people called the blob. I think Steve Robinson called it that, but I don't think he coined that phrase. But a blob of, what now we used to just call nonprofits, but now that they've started talking about NGOs, which is kind of the same thing, we're calling NGOs that basically profit off of illegal immigration, right? And it's interesting. I think people have a hard time understanding. Well, how does a nonprofit profit? It's like, I mean, really, the main difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit company is that there are people who own the for-profit company and they make money off of it. But the employees in both cases make money off of it. And a growing organization creates more money for the employees, especially the people at the top, like the CEOs, or in nonprofit world, what we call the executive directors, right? These people make a lot of money of these nonprofit organizations, and then other people within the organization profit off of nonprofits. And then there's a whole bunch of beneath that for-profit industry that sell products to products, tools, services to to the nonprofits. And I think that's what Kiango is saying. And the nonprofits pay consultants and service providers. That's where the grift is. Exactly. Right. So even though they're nonprofits, they're still like, there are people the high up within the organization, and then the people that they consult with, as Kianga is saying in the chat, who profit off of the nonprofit. So I know it's hard to understand that nonprofits profit, but they do. And take advantage really of they don't actually really care about the people coming here for the most part. They just care about profiting off of it.
Well, it's in a sense, it's a patronage network, in the sense that, someone rubs someone else's back. And you see it a little bit with sort of USAID and sort of the gutting that's taking place right there. You see that, I remember there was a organization, I can't remember the exact name, but the wife of the person who was in charge of that organization, her paintings were bought and displayed at the organization for millions of dollars. And were these paintings bought because she was a great artist? No, they were bought because, essentially there was sort of a connection where the wife's paintings would be bought and the money would sort of be funneled back into the boss's pocket, right? And this stuff is very common.
Isn't that what we call money laundering? That's kind of like what happened with the Hunter Biden paintings. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, suddenly Hunter Biden is this great painter, in between sorting Parmesan cheese off the carpet. I don't understand this, right? And people know what this is, right? But it has the veneer. It has like sort of the illusion of sort of respectability. I always joke that, why is it that you have people who are illegally crossing the border and they all seem to have the same clear backpacks with the same, essential services in that backpack, right? Because they're giving out by nonprofits that you described, and it's all part of a grift. It's all part of an industry. There's money to be made. The only color that matters at the end of the day is green.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that, like, I have some friends that I've probably told part of this story or this story before, but I have some friends, pastors. A friend of mine who's a pastor, his wife, who called me at one point, and I think you had mentioned before you came on, but we'll talk about it a little bit more later. That they discovered that there were like basically 20 kids. It turns out with adults, it was like over 30 people who were living behind the Boys and Girls Club of America in Portland in October, where it was getting down below freezing at night. And there were like 2-week-old twin babies that were there. And why were they there? And this kind of like activated her. She's not political, right? She doesn't get into politics. I mean, she votes, but she's not somebody who gets political. But she was pissed because this is not loving. This is not caring to attract these people to come here. And then, and like, again, the government in Maine, the people that are supposed to take care of people, they knew that they were there, but they didn't have the space they didn't have anywhere to put them. And so they were literally living in like a makeshift tent where they had put up, like sheets to cover them at night. And it was wild, and it really set her off.
Yeah, well, part of this also is the fact that, I live downtown Portland. I live very close to Deering Park. Deering Park, obviously just a constant source of, homelessness. But, it doesn't help the fact that, the city council is mostly controlled by people who are at least somewhat aligned with the DSA, and the recent, the local Green New Deal that limits, housing units to basically, if you build over 10 units, you're subject to a whole bunch of regulations and a whole bunch of craziness. So what do developers do? The few that aren't scared away by a city council that's controlled by a bunch of weird socialists, they build 9 units, right? So 9 units, 9 units, 9 units. and we can't get to the housing units we need to actually put people, like you mentioned, who are take them out from tents and into a building. If we're only building 9 units and we're making it probably the worst possible place to build and develop. Again, a lot of people are coming from Boston, and doing the sort of the telecommuting thing as well. So you have
Yep.
people coming in from Boston who want to live in Portland because it's far away from, the craziness. But not only are we not making it possible to build these units, we're actively sort of discouraging it.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely wild. It's one of the concerns that I have, and they've already started to a degree. So like the way that our country was founded, right, was it was supposed to be local government has the most power, state government has less, but still some, federal government has less, but still some, right? The idea was this like localized government, we the people govern ourselves, right? And so with there are certain categories where obviously like the Constitution protects from the federal government protects the rights in these categories, and so it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the general idea. And because of like a lot of these cities, or some of these cities anyway, having like aggressive anti-building policies, the state then has started enacting their own policies because we need more housing, right? And so they put in a bill a number of years ago that made it so that you could build an accessory dwelling unit for smaller homes, right? I think single up to 4 units you have on a property, something along those lines. But they basically, in so doing, they took away the rights of they disenfranchised what the people in those individual towns wanted because of the poor decisions that the people in those individual towns were doing. Like I absolutely am 100% against the policies in Portland that are discouraging building, but I don't think the state government should be taking away, the rights of the people in those towns to basically make their own laws. People are making poor decisions, and that's bad.
Yep.
But again, that's where I don't think we don't want the state to come in and affect and change that because that's a dangerous precedent. Then it's just going to switch, and we're not going to have towns with their own autonomy anymore, and everything's going to be decided at the state level. But
Well, the most dangerous thing you can say is I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that. What we're seeing is it's kind of interesting. What we're seeing is that cities and states that really get their act together in a sense and make it so that local communities have the ability to make these decisions. Because I read in California something like, when you want to build a new house, there's something like 5,000 different regulations that have to go into the process of actually. Meanwhile, in Texas, it's 300. And what do we see as a result? States like Democrats call this Apocalypse 2032. People are moving to places like even blue cities in red states like Austin. People are moving there because it's easy to build a house. You deal with 90% less craziness. And what are people doing as a result? They're moving out of California. They're moving out of New York, where I'm from. And, I'm here. I'm a member of the New York Young Republican Club. I want to make this the greatest city on earth, the greatest, sort of state on, in the union. No offense to Maine, of course. But
don't you worry.
But,
people here in Maine would love to see New York be a conservative state. We would have no offense at that.
Well,
if New York is much better.
Well, I'm joking that, I joke that, of course, here in New York, it's just Maine Southern Command. I have a lot of ties to Maine as well. But, this sort of, the good thing for Republicans, in a sense, and people who are aligned with, sort of wanting their state to be better, is that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you get these restrictions, the more you get stupid local government who doesn't know what the hell to do. They're more concerned about, equity and whatnot. The more people just leave and they go to places where things are easier. And at the end of the day, when the census is just done every 10 years, Republicans get more votes, Republicans get more states, more power shifts to people who can actually make decisions.
Well, and we're really hoping, this is a conservative podcast, and we're really hoping that we things continue to shift in that direction, because it was dangerously close. Again, I obviously Trump won the Electoral College
Mhm.
by a high margin, but a lot of the states that he had to win in order to make that happen, he didn't win by a lot. So we're dangerously close to not having conservative or Republican control. But I do think that there is a shift. Some of the stuff I keep hearing about there's two things. Like Trump has a higher approval rating now than he did in any time in his previous presidency. Number one, and number two, I was seeing this week that the approval rating of the Democrat Party went from 29%, which was already an historic low, to 27%. So they're not doing so hot, and we got to hope that continues. But one of the things that let's shift a little bit, because I want to talk about so you clearly are demonstrating that you know more about American politics than most Americans, and even most Americans that think they're involved in politics. But you're not actually and I could get myself in trouble when I say America and American politics. I mean the United States of America, because Canada is actually part of North America. So, but you're not actually
Yeah.
from here. So tell me a little bit about where you come from and how you found yourself, here in Maine, or not? Well, here in Maine,
Well,
and then New York, because yeah, that was the
Well,
key.
yeah, and again, the final goal at the end of the day is to always go back to Maine. It's sort of me and the wife, but for us, I like to. The story I always tell is the story of Cassandra from Greek myth.
Hmm.
Basically, she was given the ability to see the future, and when she was given the ability to see the future, she was also cursed because no one would believe her when she said what would happen. That was
Hmm.
her gift and her curse. And I like to say that that's a bit like me in terms of Canada. Again, in Canada, we have an immigration system that's completely out of whack. There's a million people that live in my province of Nova Scotia. Every year in Canada, 500,000 people are allowed legally into the country. So you want to talk about, just an completely out of control immigration system. Imagine, importing an entire, half of a state every single year, right? And again, the fourth most common cause of death in Canada is medical assistance and dying. Basically, it's the death law to save money. That Bernie Sanders talks a lot about how government run healthcare is so great. My grandfather died on a waiting list because he needed to get a hip replacement. People die all the time here on waiting lists. And not only that, but the quality of care is poor. There's not enough doctors at all because no one wants to work in the system.
I'm confused though.
You
The
know, we,
Democrats, anytime we bring
yep.
this up, the Democrats tell us that we're making it up. Like it's not real. It's
Okay,
actually
so
so
I'll tell
much
you
better. Like,
a very funny point is that at one point, the majority of the premiers, basically the governors of Canada, all went to the United States to get healthcare treatment. Why do they do that? Because the quality of care is better in America. People know that you're going to have, better care in America because the quality of standards are higher, right? So there's plenty of stories. I remember a story from Halifax, which is the big city, probably about an hour away from where I live, where a man was, he died in his driveway because they didn't have enough ambulances to come around and actually pick him up, right? And important to note that healthcare spending in Canada is actually rising faster than in the United States.
wow.
In the next 20 years or so, Canadians will probably spend more money on healthcare than the United States. We'll have worse outcomes, we'll have worse quality of care, and we just won't have enough doctors. Rural clinics close all the time.
Hmm. No, it's not surprising. I mean, doctors are going to go where they can get paid, which is part of the reason I think that the American healthcare system historically, I would have said I think that we're still better, but we're headed in a poor direction. But historically, the American medical system has been better than a lot of other places around the world. I do think one of the conversations, I'm going to have somebody come on the podcast next week who worked in healthcare and has seen the slow decline of American healthcare. And I really don't trust our system here anymore. Again, it's probably still better, and you can still get seen. I mean, even with the struggles, if you have an emergency, if you have something that needs to get taken care of, you can get seen pretty quickly. But we're starting to see, I think, the same types of things. So it seems to me like Canada is a bit ahead of us, in this.
Yeah, well, just quickly to touch on healthcare, the average waiting time in Canada is about 7 times more. It depends on the operation, but 7 times more than in the United States, right? People go down to the United States if they need life. The government of Quebec actually, gives out, sort of travel allowances for their citizens to go down to the United States because, they can't fulfill the requirements needed in Quebec. But, in terms of getting back to what I said, Canada is 10 years ahead in terms of crazy, weird, radical liberalism
Yeah.
and 10 years behind in sort of fashion. We're still wearing flannel. But again, there's a recent election coming. There's an election coming up in Canada. It's supposed to be announced sort of this week. And that's going to really be a big test because, Trump has sort of very much, factored into that. And you have two real distinct options between basically the two front runners, the Conservative Party of Canada and the Liberal Party of Canada. And the choice between them could not be more clear.
Yeah, well, I'd heard, and I wasn't really 100% because I don't understand how Canadian politics work, and it's not like it doesn't seem like it's like America. Maybe you can shed some light on it, but like I thought I'd heard that like the the Trudeau's party had selected the new leader, and I thought that's what it was, but it sounds like they've effectively selected their candidate who has argued that he's going to be really tough on Trump with the tariffs. He's gonna I don't know, wield the leverage he doesn't have. But
well, that's the thing, right? I'll be honest, Canada, when it comes to this, Canada can't even shift it. It has to ship its oil down to the United States to be processed because there's, such great environmentalists that they can't build a pipeline across the country, right? Most of Canada's GDP comes from trade with the United States. Out of the 10 provinces in Canada, 9 of them trade more with the United States than with provinces that are adjacent to them. Canada does not have internal free trade. There's internal, think about this, if you want to
have
ship
internal free trade.
Yes, this is the thing that,
wow.
So if you wanted to imagine this if I were to take the United States example, if you want to ship something from Maine to Boston, of course there's going to be some sort of, you might have to pay something, but if you want to ship it from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick, which is just next door, you have to pay essentially fees and tariffs, and there's no internal free trade. This is something the Germans figured out like 500 years ago in the Holy Roman Empire, but Canada just hasn't gotten around to actually, sort of, discovering it, right? But the person who's been chosen sort of to replace Trudeau is a guy called Mark Carney. He's a nefarious snake is what I'd probably describe him as. He's the former head of the Bank of England. He's the former head of the Bank of Canada. I don't use this word sort of, lightly, but he is very much a huge elitist. He represents basically the same things that, Trudeau represented: 10 years of decline, unrestricted sort of mass immigration, repression during the COVID lockdowns, cracking down on freedom of speech, and, reasons why I left Canada, reasons why I, aside from family, I will not go back.
Yep. Yeah. So that's what was going on in Canada. And then that's kind of what pushed you to leave outside of, meeting your wife and getting married. I think that's probably what caused you to move to the United States. Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the two things in regards to that, of course, I remember I had the option for her to come with me to Canada, right? This could have gone one of two ways. I could have gone down south, or she could have come up north. But I chose to go down south because, I'll be honest, what really sort of pushed me over the edge in deciding that was sort of a convoy protest that happened a few years ago, where I knew people who had donated $25 to buy coffee and donuts for a bunch of truckers who had their bank accounts frozen, who were investigated, sort of by the federal government. There were barriers for months in between provinces where you could not visit. You think it was bad in the United States. It was much worse in Canada. Imagine if you lived in Maine and you couldn't visit someone in New Hampshire for 9 months. That was basically what happened. You were not allowed, unless you had some very specific reason, to go in between provinces. The government was, in a very real sense, authoritarian.
Yeah, no, I'd heard Canada was on the list for me of like the worst, like of the in the developed world. Australia and New Zealand were also very very strict, were very strict on their lockdowns and how they treated people. I mean, Australia, there were some very substantial clashes, I think, with people who just wanted their freedom back with the police there, and it was really bad. But Canada was definitely one of the worst. From what I had heard, I know that for a long time they were. Are they allowing people in who have not received the COVID-19 vaccine yet?
So I know for that was something which, to be honest, I'd have to check. But for a
I think
very long time. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I think they might have dropped that restriction, but like it was quite a ways after like everybody else was like just to visit you don't have to, and like I was they were still requiring it just to be able to come to visit, and it's wild to me.
Well, people got, and I'm giving the best possible sort of, you know, um, argument to them. People thought originally at the time that, look, everyone gets vaccinated, all the borders can open up, all the sort of barriers to, can go away. Canada at one point had 80% of the country vaccinated and everything was still locked down. I'm sorry. What are we try getting 80% of someone to agree on? I'm sure there's 20% of people who still believe Elvis is alive, right?
Yeah.
We're I'm sorry, like, the government is not fulfilling its oath to the people of like allowing us to return to a sense of normalcy. So, as far as I'm concerned, during that time, I was thankful enough to have a job that wasn't affected. I was close to parents and folks who, were in my community, but the government had a snitch line at one point. Like, you can't, we talk about social trust and like, the ability of people and neighbors to sort of freely associate with each other in a country. A snitch line, really? You're gonna basically make it so that, do you know what the Stasi are?
No, I don't think so.
So it's basically the East German police during the
Okay.
Soviet Union. So basically, they were famous for
Okay.
having mountains of paperwork on just about it. They would surveil everyone, right? And that during COVID is essentially what they had. There were documents and sort of folders on people they were considered who had not done any sort of thing illegal, but they considered to be people of interest and who might break the law. Minority Report stuff.
I'm pretty sure they would have had stuff on me if they were here in Maine, because like I I was doing things that when in the early days of the lockdown I wrote myself a note just kind of for fun. I'm a huge fan of
Mhm.
the show Parks and Rec, and the character Ron Swanson. Unfortunately, the actor Nick Offerman does not actually have that same philosophy, and it's sad, but he does a great job playing it. And so there's this time where he wants to have a pig roast, right? And he's gonna slaughter the pig in front of a bunch of kids. That's somebody's like, you can't do that, and he's like, no, I have a permit, and he pulls out a piece of paper and it says, I can do what I want, and it has his name. And so I basically printed up something like that with a quote from him, just in case I got pulled over visiting family without permission from the government. Because that's how crazy. I mean, I didn't really think that it would be a problem that anybody would pull me over, because it's Maine, and Maine is like much smaller. It's not California after all, where you go
Mhm.
surfing by yourself, and in order to protect you from giving somebody else COVID, you have police officers arrest you and put you in jail.
You
That's
might
just
infect the fish.
yeah, right. It's so Maine's not like that, but there was still some concern that something like that might happen, and I just carried that with me for fun. Who knows if I actually would have given it to a police officer or not? But yeah, it's crazy how the lockdowns got. But I mean, obviously not nearly as bad here. But if they were keeping track of stuff here, they would have known, and somebody probably was with the digital stuff back in the corrupt FBI. Um, but
Well, I just for me, I thought, at some point, it's like, look, it's not a question of whether or not I actually do something that's wrong. It's a question of, you know, just accidentally doing something wrong, or something with the, at one point laws were changing every like 3 or 4 weeks. You can visit, folks, you can't visit folks, you can cross the border, you can't cross the border, you need this sort of paperwork to show, you don't need this paperwork to show. So it's like, it's totalitarian anarchy in a sense.
Yeah.
It's the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must.
Yeah, no, just a crazy wild time. And so like completely understandable that you would want to come down to the free America. And as bad as it was here in the United States of America, because it was bad. I remember when COVID first was coming, because
Mhm.
I'd been paying attention because of the stock market, MSNBC. I'd been seeing some of this stuff, or CNBC, I guess. I never watched MSNBC. Let's be clear about that. But CNBC, the business side that was focused on the stock
Mhm.
market. And so there were people talking about this thing called COVID that was coming, and I was like, we're not going to lock down like China, right? And I actually would say we're not even going to lock down at all, right? And so like when we all of a sudden locked down, and I'm driving to work because we were still in the office,
Mhm.
and I don't see a single car on the way there. I was just like, what in the world is going on? But even given that, like compared to, things in other parts of the world, most of the rest of the world, in fact, America was still the most free. And I honestly attribute that largely to the fact that we have this thing called the Second Amendment, and the government understands that there's only so far that we'll let them push us. um and they
Well,
pushed us about that far. But
well,
not
two things to
yeah.
to comment on that. I was going to say is that I like to use the expression that America is the skinniest kid at fat camp. It's the idea that listen, you think you have it bad, it's much worse, pretty much everywhere else, right? So, of course,
Yeah.
other problems with the United States, of course, there's lots, right? But you don't know how good you have it, right? And that's part of the
Yeah.
reason why I'm here. But again, the Second Amendment, recently, but this was about a year and a half ago. Uh, Trudeau and the Liberal government essentially brought in, if there was sort of some very limited, handgun ownership laws that still existed, but at this point, total, complete, 100% handgun ban in Canada. It's extremely difficult to even get a pistol. It's very extremely difficult to even get a long rifle, to get like a hunting rifle. In Canada, because you have to go through tests, you have to go through certification, you have to pay fees. It's not just going down to the local LL Bean and picking up, some BB gun to go plinking, right? So it's much more, what's funny about that too is that they kept delaying actually putting it into effect because they're so incompetent that they couldn't actually find a way to, make sure that everyone turned in their actual firearms. So it's that sort of, like I mentioned before, it's anarchy and it's tyranny. It's the idea that we want to repress you, but we're too stupid to know how to do it. So we're just going to say that we're going to do it, so hopefully we can scare you.
Yeah. It was a crazy time. So that's what brought you down. But one of the things we were talking about is, I think there was this assumption, and we always talk about again how farther along Canada is, but then you came to Portland. And what was your experience experiencing, Portland after, having been in Canada, thinking you're coming to a freer country?
Well, I got to say, I was impressed at just how unimpressed I was. Listen, I love Portland. The thing, it is sort of, at the end of the day, it is a very nice place. It's just, it's a city that's controlled by the DSA. There's a lot of problems with it. It doesn't, it's not attracting the businesses that should. It is very liberal at the end of the day. Just like, not even like, I've been to Portland, Oregon as well. And Portland, Oregon did not seem as much, to the left as Portland, Maine, right? And I like to joke that it's people like me, it's New Yorkers coming up from getting their second houses and bringing their politics with them to Portland. But there was I thought my small town was bad, sort of in Halifax as well. But I honestly saw more homeless. I saw more crime. I saw, a lot of problems that I think are quite easily fixable if the city would not stop voting for people like, well, in my district, my representative was Rachel Talbot Ross,
Hmm.
and that's really all I need to say.
Yeah.
That's the, you know, end of story right there, right?
Yeah, yeah, she obviously not it just like she not only is she just a far left Democrat, but also there's a lot of corruption
Mhm.
that the main wire is actually exposed, talking about how like she's got family members that are getting government contracts, and just like how I think actually Ed Tomich of the main wire had gone on one of their meetings and just all of a sudden spoke up and was like, is this a problem that, and he highlighted how, Rachel Talbot Ross's, I think, sister or something like that's business was getting money from something that she was part of the overseeing the appropriations of. And this is just a little sketchy and unethical, on top of the fact that she
Yeah.
just is again, one of the problems, like I would love to have the opportunity to have more parties, or at least more of a spectrum, but it seems like you either have definitely according to the media, you either have somebody who is a leftist, is a Democrat, like the current version, or you're a far right extrememst. Despite the fact that it's actually the left that is extreme, which is like I was having this conversation, like I've kind of started pushing back a little bit on people where they're like, oh, they're the extremes. They just keep getting more and more extreme. And it's like, well, I mean, the right is seeming extreme because of how far the left is going. But the right, like a lot of people on the right today are like JFK Democrats, and a lot of
Well,
moderates. And
I was just gonna say, just in, one person I have to actually, sort of shout out in a sense is, I honestly think that Mayor Dion, for all, the fact that he is a Democrat, he's at least somewhat, more reasonable than half the other city council.
yeah,
I almost feel bad for him, having to deal with like, people who, they couldn't pour piss out of a boot if the instructions were written on the heel, right? We're talking about
yeah,
we're talking about not the brightest bulbs, in, in the package, right? But I think one thing that I would like to mention is just the Portland Press Herald is probably the worst newspaper, maybe in the world. I'll be honest, uh, tr- terrible.
it,
And I remember, I'm not sure if it's still, the writer is still employed, but there was a writer called the Masked Maine Millennial who authored for the Portland Press Herald, you have to look it up. It's the worst articles. This is like high school, like Bernard College, Columbia, Gaza level of writing. It's I'm a teacher by trade, right? I've seen my ninth grade students write better than this woman. Incredible that this was even published. The Portland Press Herald, beyond trash. Not fit to wipe anyone's behind with.
yeah. Well, I mean, and that's when you're not good at the news, at doing the
Mhm.
news, you don't make money, right? And so like there's not a lot of people who are paying attention to the Portland Press Herald, which is why it's like fired or laid off, or seen resign multiple members in higher leadership, and then they've got let go a whole bunch of other people. The main wire has been doing some reporting on it, so it's no
Mhm.
surprise. It's just like what's happening with the mainstream, any type of mainstream
Mhm.
news right now is not doing well. And Portland Press Herald is as you said, it's one of the worst. It's so partisan. It doesn't report the news. It only and it literally is now the propaganda arm of the governor, as they're literally paying them
Well,
to write
and I
puff
want to say
pieces.
that, I want to say that, like, at the very least, the Washington Post, say what you will, at least the quality, like in terms of, they've got more money so they can spend more on quality. Imagine the Portland Press Herald is a third-rate Washington Post, which is a third-rate newspaper, right? So it's like a sixth-rate. You know, I would like, and I really do mean it when I say that, I've read a lot of liberal rags up in
Yep.
Canada. There are a lot of really crappy newspapers. The Portland Press Herald is the worst newspaper I have ever had the misfortune of, you know, seeing on the regular.
Yeah, wow, that's saying a lot, having come from Canada, and and like with all the other opportunities around the world, around the country. So,
Mhm.
uh, yeah, they really are bad. I mean, just, and but again, like I would just say that part of the reason this podcast exists is like by the way, this is not like when I thought to myself, what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to spend, some of my free time doing? I thought, you know what? I want to stare at a screen and talk to people about politics. No, I didn't. In fact, I didn't want to get involved in politics outside of voting. But the insanity of the left forced my hand, and here I am. And the fact that the mainstream media, the main wire is doing a lot of really good stuff, but they can't do it alone. They can't do everything. And so, we need more information on the things that are happening in our world. And this is why we exist, because I would love it if the mainstream media, the Portland Press Herald, these other organizations actually started doing their job, because then I could go back to like living my life and doing other things that are more enjoyable than politics. Politics, while I'm interested in it, it's not because I like it. It's because we're at this. It's kind of funny. I'm this strange person who people sometimes think of. I'm an extrovert. I use this as an example, but I'm not an extrovert. But I do a lot of things that you would think that's the reason that people think I'm an extrovert. So I also some people think I'm not controversial. What is it? Confrontational. And none of these things are true, right? I'm doing things because I think they need to be done. So I'll be controversial, or not controversial, but confrontational if confrontation is necessary. I'll do the things that an extrovert will do if that's what I need to do to grow our movement or grow my business or whatever, even though I don't like doing those types of things. And that's why I'm having these conversations about politics. It's not because I love it. It's because we need better information and more information in the world. And it's because the Portland Press Herald and other news organizations have decided that they would rather be propaganda arms of the left than actually do their job.
Yeah. Well, one of the things there's the old quote that goes, "The people who are obsessed will always win over the people who just want to be left alone." Yeah. It sounds to me like you've been forced into this in a sense, that people have just, people who just want to be left alone, after a while, sort of in the same way that you see on the Gadsden flag, the same way the snake, it only bites when it's threatened. It only bites when someone comes over and starts stomping around its territory, right? So I feel like a lot of people are the same way as you. I'm a little bit different. I'm a politics junkie. I'm a guy who's worked, like I mentioned before, campaigns for like the last, since I've been 13 years old, right?
What can it be?
For me, it's sort of like,
are there any good politicians in Canada?
So one that's really sort of making the rounds is a guy called Pierre Poilievre, who you may have heard before. The leader of the Conservative Party. He's the guy who was eating the apple during the clip. You may have seen that.
Okay.
But he's the leader of the Conservative Party. He's sort of a populist, but at the same time, something that is kind of interesting is a lot of conservatives in Canada, they're very much split on Donald Trump and America. I like to joke that the only culture that that Canada has is that it's not America. I'm very much a downer on my former homeland, because when I ask them, what makes an American, right? The Constitution, the Revolutionary War, apple pie, barbecue, everything's bigger in Texas, right? If I ask someone from Canada, they say, "Duh, we're not American," and that's pretty much it in a sense. So I joke that it's a Bureau of Land Management for selling cheap land to people who are not originally from Canada. So very much a downer. But so Pierre Poilievre is the leader of the Conservatives. The recent election that I mentioned before that's coming up, I believe it's scheduled for April 28th. He is the candidate there. He is a step in the right direction, but Canada has to make a lot of steps in the right direction before it's on sort of a better footing. Because, in Canada, we have, you might have heard of the NDP, the New Democratic Party. They're an openly socialist party. We have the Bloc Québécois, which are the separatist party in Quebec. They win seats as well. Canadian politics is much more parties, more stupid people. If you think there's no good politicians, in America, just wait till you see what's on the other side of the border.
Yeah, no, I don't really want to. There are some things that might cause me to visit Canada, but I definitely don't want to be there or study their politics. But hopefully they get somebody more intelligent. I do want better things for the world, and so I think I want these countries to elect better leaders that actually care about them and actually have a good head on their shoulders. I mean, what's interesting is like Trump is doing what I think is really important. People are criticizing him, and people are concerned about the negative impacts of the tariffs. But again, we kind of hold the cards. We have been feeding the rest of the world really for the past 30 years basically since we started. I mean, probably even before this, but when we started the free trade movement in the 90s under
Mhm.
Clinton, we've really like made a lot of wealth for a lot of people around the world, and like Europe and Canada in particular are two areas where they have done things that have harmed their economies, and the only way that they've been able to survive and not fall into oblivion is because of them leeching off of the United States of America,
And
tariffing us while not being tariffed themselves, and doing crafty things so that they can sell their stuff here. And like Trump is basically like, we're done with this game. And they're not happy.
well, the one thing I'll tell you a really sort of interesting mini story here. In Canada, one of them, by the way, Canada tariffs a ton of goods from the United States, for everything from car parts to electronics to one thing in particular is milk. Milk in Canada is controlled by a dairy cartel, aka basically in Canada, a few milk farmers who live in very competitive seats in the country are able to essentially dictate terms to the government. Millions of if you remember during the start of COVID, actually, you were seeing all those images of farmers dumping milk onto their farms because they couldn't ship it abroad, right? And there was no market for it. That happens every year in Canada. Milk is the number one thing that people cross the border in the United States to buy because it's like 3 times as expensive. And the reason why it's expensive is because American milk is tariffed over 300%. AKA, it's 300% more expensive to buy it in Canada because important people in the dairy cartel in Canada. It's like it really is described as a cartel. Essentially lobby the government to make sure that farmers dump milk on their fields, waste it, so that the supply is limited. It's called supply management in Canada.
Mm.
And that way, American producers cannot compete with Canadian producers because everything's tariffed. And by the way, these are the same that raises the price of milk. And these are the same people, the Liberal Party of Canada, who say, oh, we're for working class, strong families. And, these conservatives, they're so mean. And they're charging single mothers like, $9 a gallon for milk. They're, slaves to, a dairy cartel, a bunch of farmers in, Ontario and Quebec, right? So, by the way,
That's
three
pretty
hundred
wild.
percent softwood lumber, electronics, car parts, sausages, chicken, eggs, everything is. There are a lot of tariffs from Canada. These have been in place for 40 plus years.
Well, and that's the thing. Like we don't usually talk national politics, but these tariffs do impact main businesses, right?
Mhm.
And like, there is going to be some short term pain from those. But the reality is, we are being, and this is the exact point, we are being taken advantage of by Canada because we had soft people in Washington who were letting it happen. And in the long run, like if we can take back control of this and get things into a much better situation, then I think there's more potential. It will be better in the long run. Sometimes we have to go through some pain. It's like use the example, sometimes you go to the chiropractor. I go to the chiropractor. Some people call them the witch doctor, but if you find a good chiropractor, they're worth going to. um, and like you go in, they do their adjustment, and like I think a lot of people have this assumption that you should come out feeling better, and it's like, well, that's not exactly how it works. It's just like if similar to like you go and you have surgery sometimes, right?
Mhm.
There's a bit of it's worse with surgery, but there's a bit of a recovery period. There's a period of time where you feel worse, but in the long run, you end up being better, and that's what we're dealing with right now with some of these things. Like in the short term, is there going to be some pain associated with this tariff situation? Sure, but in the long run, it's going to be better for us. But Shifting a bit. So you worked in politics. You can speak about that too. I'll let you. You feel like you
Well,
want
I
to
was just going to
respond.
say
Yeah.
very, very quickly, I'm just going to point out one of the ways in which I think Canada sort of takes advantage that's local to Maine is when it comes to the lobster fishery. You know, I come from
Oh
Nova
yeah.
Scotia. There's a big lobster fishing industry. And essentially what happens is that in Maine, the length that you have to have the carapace, which is, you know, the length of the lobster, is 3.14 inches, about 8.25 centimeters. Um, it needs to be that length in order to keep it. Canada took a look at this, right? And they bumped the limit up to 3.25 centimeters, inches. So what you have is you have lobster fishermen in Maine in the territorial waters throwing back lobsters, which are not to legal length, and Canadian boats just on the other side of the international waters, right? Picking up those lobsters that float over to one side, or, you know, sort of taking advantage of sort of the lax regulations because they realized, oh, wait, you know, in Maine, right, you can keep lobsters that are this length, but to, you know,
Yep.
take advantage of fishermen.
I might have missed you there at the end. So, but basically, yeah. If you want to just restate that.
So sorry, I was just going to say, just 1 second here. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. I was just going to say that essentially what happens is, you know, Canada saw the opportunity to impose sort of a limit for lobster fishing. You know, they said, look, you come over to this side, you can capture lobsters that are technically smaller, right? So in order to do that, they did that, and now you have Canadian boats sort of in the frontier zone between Maine and Canada who go and they collect, you know, lobsters. You know, they take advantage of, you know, the regulations on the Maine side, which are, you know, more strict, and
Yep.
you know, Maine fishermen are poorer for it.
Well, it's a great example of generally speaking, a lot of the stupid policies in America. We had Jerry Lehman on. I can't remember what episode number it was, but it was like a while back in late January. Jerry Lehman runs NEFSA, New England Fisheries Stewardship Association. As we were talking, like what they're doing with the food industry, with the way in which they're regulating them, they're making it more difficult to, like, basically he was one of the biggest takeaways that I had is he shares the story. This is actually what caused him to start the organization. Is that there was a year where they were basically having record catch of, I think it might have been codfish, I can't remember exactly, but one of the fish, and like just record catch so much they didn't have to try that hard, and they were coming back and they had so much fish, right? And NOAA, the organization that one of the organizations that oversees that industry, came in and said, no, you can only catch 20% of your normal catch because there's not enough of that type of fish. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, there's tons of fish. You're crazy. You have no idea what you're talking about. And yet you're the ones regulating, right? And what do you think happened, right? Because people still want to eat the same amount of fish, so they're still going to buy them. And those fish, international water, I mean, when you're in the water, you're not like, oh, here's the border, I'm an American fish, I'm going to swing it. You know, they're going to go everywhere. The Canadians are going to pick them up, they're going to sell them back to America for more money, because that's what happens. Sell them back to Americans for more than the American fishermen here in Maine could sell them for. So it's pretty crazy, and it kind of gets at like a lot of things in America. Like we basically through regulation shut down our so much of our manufacturing, pushed it overseas because of environmental regulation, things like that. Well, is that, do we live in a global environment, or do we live in a national environment? Like when they want to talk about like global climate change and stuff like that, whether or not you are 100% on board with their theories around it, the practices, the ways in which they try to carry it out are not practical and are not helpful. And again, we've shipped our manufacturing to to China, which has basically no environmental regulations, and so it's just another one of those things where these policies that just what the net result, the end result is just harm to American companies and benefit to other
Yeah,
countries.
exactly. I mean, you said it about as perfectly as I could. You know, and I mean, at the end of the day, reshoring, getting American jobs back, is good for the world. It's good for consumers in America, and you know, it's good for just the general public.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about like your background in education and like, because that's been a huge topic of
Mhm.
conversation here. So I'm really curious, like how education in Canada compares to what's going on here in America.
So, for me, my background is in education and teacher for at this point, we're getting close to 8 years now. Sometimes I can't believe it myself. But yeah, I taught in Canada. I was what they call it essentially a long-term supply teacher, which is that there's always a need for sort of substitute teachers wherever they are. And I kind of like that because essentially what it would do is I would have the ability to go wherever I chose. So if I wanted to teach a science class of ninth graders one day, I would report to that building. If I want to teach a primary class, I had the opportunity to do that. So that's my background. I've seen every level in a sense. I like to joke, I've taught every single level, every single, sort of subject possible. And what I've sort of experienced from that is, you know, I was in a education classroom. This was when I was getting my degree, and this was what we call social studies. Basically, it's history, geography, everything sort of wrapped up together, right? And 30 people that were in the classroom. One of the teachers asked, like, raise your hand if you know who John A. Macdonald was. John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada. So I thought at the time, oh, of course, it's a social studies classroom. These people are going to be teaching history in a year, right? They should know who John A. Macdonald was. 10 people raised their hand. 20 people did not know. The majority of people in the classroom did not know who the first Prime Minister of Canada was. Imagine if a history teacher in the United States did not know who George Washington was. Fired. That's the word. So they have, it's like most universities nowadays. They'll teach a lot about DEI and, a lot about sex ed for primary school kids, but they won't teach like who the Prime Minister of Canada was. Priorities out of whack, more focused on indoctrination and more focused on stressing a message. And a lot more comes from the actual federal government in Canada for schools. So you have a situation where if you do not teach what the federal government does at the time, the federal government can and will withhold a lot of funds from your school.
Yeah, which this is why I'm really excited about Donald Trump. I don't know if he signed it yet. I think he's signing it in 15 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, where he's going to disband the Department of Education. It doesn't mean that government funding won't be coming, but apparently I believe that he's going to be signing an executive order or just signing whatever to shut down the Department of Education and get the federal government basically largely out of state, the education system. But I do still think that there's money that will be coming back from the state, from the federal government, and there are always strings attached with that, as we're finding out here in Maine, because we're in violation of Title IX because we want boys to biological males, as we call them, but boys competing in women's sports. So it's lots of fun, but there are strings attached here. But yeah.
Well, I like to joke that, the Department of Education was created in 1977, I think, under the Carter administration, and the United States has dropped about 30 spots in terms of actual world education. So great job, Department of Education. You've done, and, by the way, if we were to name a villain here, Randy Weingarten from the Association of Teachers. I'm not sure. Have you heard of her, Randy Weingarten?
The name, I think so. I think I've seen some videos that she's been in.
Evil. There's no other word to say. There's no other word to actually describe it. She is.
Yeah. I again, from some of the things that I've seen, I don't spend a lot of time looking into that. Mostly, I try to focus on what's going on here in the state of Maine. But I remember leading up to the election, I think she was the one who was basically trying to get people to make sure they go out and vote against Trump. They didn't really have anybody to get people to vote for, so they had to get people to vote against Trump. Like
well, I mean, she was the big candidate. Well, she was the big pusher behind. She basically manages all the, she's the head of all the public teachers in the United States, in a sense, sort of answer to her. if you're and if you're wondering why schools were locked down for so long, it's because she basically argued that, listen, there's a 0.0000001% chance that one of our teachers could get COVID that's easily survivable and will give them nothing more than the flu. But we don't care about your kids actually getting a successful, fulfilling education in Maine. We only care about lining our pockets so that we can contribute to Democrats. And the National Association of Teachers is one of the top sort of donors to the Democrat Party in the United States.
Wow. Yeah, no, yeah, and a lot of other candidates, yeah, of the specific candidates, and one of the biggest problems in education that it frequently gets cited as to why we have the problems that we have, and is the not the Department of Education, but the unions and this type of out of state money, people trying to control the system and giving lots of money to people who agree with them to help them get elected and maintain control. And obviously it's dangerous, but money isn't working as much, going as far as it used to. And I think with turning off the spigots and less money going to these NGOs and things like that, it'll be really interesting to see how much money is spent in the next election cycle. But also, like, again, what we learned with Trump is that he spent 1/3 of what Kamala Harris spent, and he still won because they're spending it smarter. So obviously, I think the truth is on our side, and so we have a really good chance of picking things up and continuing to move forward, which is really what this is. This is all about for me, is trying to find ways to help people, but again, better understand what's going on. I think like hearing what's going on in America from a Canadian perspective, and seeing how, like, we're not. It may be in Portland and some of those other places we're a little further along than Canada, but in Canada, they're as you had kind of said, they're killing old people. That's like part of euthanasia is the term for that, I think, right?
So euthanasia is part of it. But in Canada it's called MAID, medical assistance in dying. It is the number 4 largest cause of death in Canada. And the reason why is you have veterans, you have people who have mild depression, you have people who like lost a leg in an accident, being told and encouraged by the federal government, saying, hey, you're getting too expensive. Have you considered killing yourself yet? It's funny now, if you go on Twitter, a slang term that a lot of people say is Canadian healthcare is basically a synonym for suicide. To that point, because I mean, the reason the other joke is that you'll never get someone on the other line if you call the Canadian government, but you will if you call MAID. You will if you got one.
Yeah.
If you actually need help with services, you won't get anyone. But if you say you want to off yourself, they'll do it for you. And by the way, this most importantly, is that because this is at a country within the United States by far. Canada has more reliant on immigration, and yet what did the federal government pass recently? Euthanasia and free contraceptives, basically nationwide. What are we doing?
Yeah,
have more babies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's interesting. So it's, I think that's like we need to have more people in order to fulfill the jobs that we need to have fulfilled and things like that. But I think the Democrat side is they want to have less babies because they believe that there's a concern with the environment. More people is bad for the world. Is kind of the belief system of the far left, and so that's why they don't want. But then we end up, because of that what ends up happening is they just need, because the society still needs to function. And I think Japan is one of the countries that's in the worst state as far as this goes, but the United States is there, and obviously Canada's there, where we're not having enough children to replace our existing population, which usually leads to I've been hearing a lot of it leads to the collapse of a society if you're not having enough children to be able to replace the number of people. And so knowing that they need this is where they've had these really aggressive immigration policies and things like that. So but yeah, it's crazy that they're trying to get people to kill themselves, and that's just kind of I think it's worth talking about, because that's what's coming I mean, that type of language, and people are making arguments in that direction. First, it was the gender cult, which has gone crazy. I think here in America, and like mandatory gender affirming care to the point where Jordan Peterson, who's one of the best minds, I think, in definitely in his field, but possibly one of the smartest men we have alive today, was basically pushed out of Canada. And now we've got this type of stuff. And when I first started hearing about this, you're like, how can this be true that they're actually trying to convince people to kill themselves? And I think one of the worst stories I heard, I think this was back when I used to listen to the Daily Wire, where these two young girls went on a trip to another country, and I think they were like in their 20s or 30s or something like that, and they just
Mhm.
decided while they were in this country where you could kill yourself to kill themselves. They didn't have signs of depression or anything like that, and they just opted for these assisted suicides. And so the idea that you have a government that's pushing people to kill themselves is absolutely insane, and it's just north of the border. It's where like Trump, a lot of Trump stuff about like, oh, let's make Canada the 51st state. I'm like, no, we still want to win elections, buddy. We like, if we bring them in, like they're so far gone, and I don't know if there's hope, for them to be able to turn around and come into more sanity, given that they've let what has happened happen. Now, one of the things that people talk about here, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, like, how is it like? So part of the question becomes like, how in the world are people voting along those lines? And so, given how crazy it is, and so part of the question becomes like, is it voter fraud? Because like a lot of people here always want to point to voter fraud. There are people who think that the only reason that Maine isn't a red state is because of voter fraud, and I'm like, no, you haven't been to Portland. Like, like I live in these places. The vast majority of people who are here are Democrats, even with the insanity. Maine as a state, maybe there might be some voter integrity stuff that might potentially shift some of the elections throughout the course of the state, but I don't really. But like, how, like, is that a problem there, or are people just so ideologically captured and I think programmed through the education system and control of information?
So I actually worked for Elections Canada, which is the national board sort of elections in the entire country. And I'll tell you, there is more certification and more security with, the Canadian system than the American system. And I mean that sincerely. It's for us, it was, at least in the place that I worked, paper ballots, no electronics, double tracking to make sure everything was fine. We got training sessions. People were paid by the government. They had an incentive to. I was trusted with ballot boxes, and they said, "Look, we find out you try to tamper with this in any sort of way, we will sue your pants off. Right? You will be going to prison. Right?" So, in terms of actual security, Canada does it better. We count votes faster than you guys. I
Yeah,
mean, I'm not throwing shade
especially
here,
then.
but it's true.
Well, feel free to throw shade on California, which somehow counted ballots long enough that they picked up 3 additional seats in the House.
Well, I mean, it's just because I actually do study this a little bit. The California law basically allows for ballots to, as long, they say as long as they're postmarked by a certain date. So if their election is November 5th, as long as November 5th is on the ballot, like the actual piece of mail, they're legally obligated to keep counting that. So, well, mail could be slow, mail could be delayed, mail could take extra time to get there. So you do have ballots showing up 3 weeks later and expecting to be counted. That and you may think, oh, it's a few ballots. No, I'll tell you why. In Iowa, I remember there was a case of a Republican who won her seat by a total of 6 votes. 6 votes. Al Franken won his seat in Minnesota by something like 250 votes, and they found those votes like in the backseat of a car parked outside his campaign office that had been opened during a snowstorm. I'm sorry. And there was in North Carolina. This was a case, just to show that I'm bipartisan here. This was the case on the Republican side, where you had a candidate in North Carolina's congressional district, I think it was the ninth, who had essentially admitted to, yeah, I did massive amounts of vote dumping, into ballot boxes. I committed voter fraud, and they had to run the entire election all over again.
Wow.
this is this is not like we're talking about. Everyone always goes back to the 2000 election with the butterfly ballots in Florida.
Florida. Yep.
I can't imagine if that were to happen. If that were to happen nowadays, you would have a violence on the street, and I'm not being hyperbolic, right?
Yeah. No. No.
Um,
Absolutely.
but in terms of ideological capture, I really have to point the finger at the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It is Pravda of the North. This is a organization that takes. Imagine if PBS had a much more massive budget. This is an organization which pumps out propaganda on the regular. There's a constant connection between the Liberal Party of Canada and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It's very much a thing where people work for the CBC, then they go into Canadian politics as a liberal, and they turn out state propaganda, right? They toe the line. If you look up CBC, liberalism, you'd have a whole list, and more so than like at least MSNBC. It's very open in its partisanship. People just take what's said by the CBC at face value. And getting back, I just want to comment. One thing when we were mentioning before about medical assistance in dying, I want to mention the case of Pulse. He was a man who had hearing loss. He was 61 years old. His only thing that he had written down was that he had hearing loss, and he was recommended that he receive medical assistance in dying. The state euthanized someone because he was sad about his hearing loss. What kind of society exists that allows that to happen? A society that allows that to happen, frankly, it deserves to go extinct.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the things that are going on in our world. Like, I don't agree with some of these people, right? Like, I don't agree with these people, so I'm gonna preface it with that. Like, but I like, so there's a couple of things that I'll say. Is like one is like you hear about some of these like what I'll call crazy QAnon, conspiracy theories, and you're like, oh my gosh, how could you possibly believe that? That politicians are drinking the blood of aborted babies underneath Congress to stay young. It's like, okay, that's
the moon
crazy,
is full of cheese.
right?
The moon is full of cheese.
The moon, we did or didn't go to the moon. The Earth is flat, and the list goes on, right? There's a lot of these kind of there's a lot of debate when I bring this up to people that I know about the us whether or not we went to the moon. Apparently, there's a lot of people who tend to believe that one, but regardless, there's a lot of others, and I could go into them, but I can understand where people are coming from when they they buy into that, partly because like the things that are actually happening are crazy, right? Like some of these things that are happening, like again, we've got a country north of the border that's like trying to convince people that are sad about being blind or hearing loss that to kill themselves, that people who are suffering from depression who are being encouraged to euthanize themselves. Like this is wild. This is the upside down. We've got a society that is promoting and pushing mutilation of minors without parental consent. We have just like abortion all the way up until birth, which like most people are not like in favor of. Like and there's a lot of other crazy things that are actually really happening in our society, and so it's understandable when there's crazy things that are happening for people to believe in other things that maybe aren't happening. But it's like, how do I know what's real and what isn't real at this point?
Well,
that's part of it.
At this point, that 20 years ago, it used to be that a conspiracy theory and the truth, there was about 10, 15 years you'd find out. Now it's like 4 months. You find out what ends up saying, oh, this is a conspiracy theory. 4 months later, oh, it's the truth. But one thing about Canada, bringing it up, is Canada is one of the only countries on earth with absolutely no restrictions on abortion whatsoever. Listen, whatever you think about abortion, right?
Yep.
It is the only, if a woman walks into, some sort of doctor's clinic at 8.5 months, it very much is the Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, we take the baby out and then we decide what to do with it. Right. There are no restrictions. The only other place on earth, by the way, for that is North Korea. There is, I'm sorry,
Wow.
at
Well,
8.5 months.
there basically are none
Yeah.
in Maine now too because of LD 1619 from 2023, I believe.
Well, I like to joke that I've said this to a few people that Maine, being close to Canada, is a bit like, it's a bit like Gondor in Lord of the Rings. It's a bit like Gondor being close to Mordor. The evil
Yeah.
sort of seeps in and sort of influences and affects certain ways. People go up
Yeah.
north to Canada, they come back with all these kooky ideas, right? Same thing with Bernie Sanders in Vermont. Coming back, but
Oh my gosh.
no restrictions on abortion whatsoever. In Canada, it's all at the doctor's discretion. Um, you know, and again, this is the society that people have chosen to sort of live in. And
Well,
what's worse about it is, go on. What were
oh
you
no,
gonna
I
say?
was just gonna say is but this is why this was my initial point. Like this is why there's a couple of
Mhm,
things that I think are. So I'm a Christian, and there are some difficult things in the Bible for people historically.
mhm,
And it's where God tells the people of Israel, historic Israel, not current Israel, to go in and wipe out this group of people because they are so evil, they are so corrupt that they're just doing awful, horrible, evil things. And
mhm.
in those societies, they're like sacrificing their children um, to these idols and this, that, and the other thing, like putting their kids into the fire, kind of thing, is how it's presented,
Moloch.
right? Moloch, exactly, right. So, so anyway, so this is what's happening, and they're so evil, they're so corrupt that go and wipe them out entirely, right? And so I think about these things, and I hear there are some people that I've told to like basically shut up recently, who in main Twitter, who have been suggesting that no more voting. We need to, we've got cartridges instead, and it's like, hold up just a bit. I mean, like I get it, I understand, like on the one level, if you like some of the things that are happening, and like I
Mhm,
have a friend who works in a hospital, who actually has had to treat and care for some of these 12-year-old kids that have been mutilated, and like I like just like my blood boils, and like I want to stop this stuff from happening. I think it's corrupt and evil, you know and so like like the things that our society is doing, I understand. And I kind of like, if I didn't believe in God and I didn't understand that he says vengeance is mine, declares the Lord, I will repay, I would want to go all Boondock Saints and be like, let's find the people and let's just like take them out, right? The people who are
mhm,
really in charge, because it's not the local people primarily. They're complicit.
mhm,
It's kind of, I like to quote V for Vendetta when I'm talking about this. It's not that, but there's the sense when he's like explaining what's going on to all the people. He's like, if you're looking for the guilty, well, there are those who are more responsible than others, and they will be held accountable. But if you're looking for the guilty, you need only look into a mirror. We're all to a degree complicit. Um,
mhm.
but ultimately, there are people who are much more responsible, and those are the people that I would want to deal with. But I also, to bring
Well,
another fun movie reference into it, and then I'll let you shoot back.
sure. Yeah,
I
yeah.
just I gotta land this plane, and that's like Batman. Like, so as bad as it is, and as scary as it is right now, I don't believe, like Batman, who initially gets trained by Ra's al Ghul, and he's like, "Where are we going? We're going to go take out Gotham," and Bruce is like, no, there's still good people there. And he's like, you're defending a nation or a city that's we've been able to infiltrate every level. It's so corrupt, we've been able to infiltrate every level of the infrastructure. And Batman is like, soon to be Batman is basically like, no, we've like, there's still hope for this place. We need to defend it. We need to give it more time. We need to go in and work toward correcting and reforming this society, not giving up on it. And that's kind of where I think we're at in Maine. I get the frustration and the concern and how crazy things are and wanting to do something, but we're not there. And there's still hope.
Mhm. Well, people have the option to, we have ballots every like 2 years, every 4 years to, sort of throw the bums out, right?
Yep.
During the election in 2024, I was in New York. I made must have been 15,000 phone. I really do mean this, 15,000 phone calls in
Wow.
support of Donald Trump. At one point, I was the number one caller in the entire state of New York for Donald. did my best to sort of send out messages, getting so mini straight Scott Pressler in a sense, if you know who that is.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I was doing, and we have bullets and tossing people out. This sort of nonsense. That's for the people who firebomb Tesla dealerships. We're better than this. We are
Absolutely.
I like to. I like to joke, and this has sort of become a joke online, is that there are two types of people in this world: those who return the shopping cart and those who don't return the shopping cart. We are the people who return the shopping cart because we realize
Absolutely.
that there are other people who are going to come, after us. It sullies the soul to be, a miserable sort of human being whose only sort of, outlet in life is like bombing it. I'm sure you've seen the thing with Tim Waltz recently where he gets up and checks the stock ticker and sees that the Tesla stock has gone down. What a pathetic human being, to cheer on the destruction of an American company because, I'm sorry, you lost, you fat idiot. Now go back to Minnesota.
Well, he was terrible. That's why this would be like Kamala was bad, and he wasn't worse, but he was not better. He was not great. He was pretty awful candidate. But the good news there is that I realized I need to go buy Tesla stock. Right. That's what I learned through. I saw that.
Buy the dip.
I was like, time to buy some Tesla. Like I've been saying when it was like over $400, I was like, it's a little high. If we can get it down below 350 or 300, time to buy. And so I was like, oh shoot, it's in the 200s. Thank you. I'm gonna go buy some, and so that's kind of where I'm at. But
the market is self-correcting.
But to your point, yeah, we're not like that. We can be the bigger people, and I think that's something that we are doing. Like right now, not only are they doing that to the Teslas, but you've got all this doxing that's going on. Not doxing, but the swatting that's going on. And it didn't get a lot of press, but you have the one of the guys who worked at InfoWars that was murdered. Alex Jones
in Texas.
In Texas, in Austin, on his way home from work after doing a show. And so like that's the left, that's their stuff. They're crazy. They're the ones that are violent. People want to, it's so funny. And unfortunately it's because of the mainstream media, but outside of quote unquote January 6th, the Republican,
where no one was killed, where no police officers were killed, where no one was.
Four protesters died. 4 protesters died. 2 of heart attacks. One was bludgeoned to death, and one was shot. But yeah, there were no people.
Ashley Babbitt, we will remember her.
That's absolutely right, Ashley Babbitt. And there was another woman who maybe was being a little ornery, but like she ended up getting knocked down, and the police officer was literally bludgeoning her. Like she's on the ground, passed out, and he's just like beating her with a baton. And a couple other people, like I said, died of heart attacks. And so, yeah, conservatives are actually not violent. Like that's that. Generally speaking, it's interesting. We have all the guns, and yet we're not responsible for the gun deaths that happen in America. That's like basically just criminals, right? And so, like, we're law-abiding citizens, and so that's not. We don't need to play these games. We just keep fighting, and we won in 2024. I think here in Maine, I'm really hopeful. Like, there's a number of things that I've been seeing, but number one is this Title IX issue where I think it's an 80-20 issue, and I think we're going to win. I think that's going to really help us. It's activated some people, and it's started to bring some people over to our side. We need more to happen between now and the gubernatorial race, but I think we actually have a real chance. I'm not crazy. I tend to be. I'm not optimistic. I try to be realistic. But I would say I'm a bit optimistic in the sense that I think we have a chance. Some things have to go our way. We need a couple of key things to happen, and we need to continue to build our momentum. But there is a movement. I kind of feel like this is the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe moment where Ashland is on the move, and like there's something stirring here in Maine, and I think that there's hope to really do. In Maine, what Donald Trump did in the nation in 2020 in 2026, and actually take back the House, the Senate, and the governor's race, and begin to bring some sanity back here to the state of Maine. So that's what I'm
Well,
hopeful for.
and it's not going to be easy. Again, the easy solution that a lot of people would do is let's go firebomb a Tesla dealership. No, that's not. The hard part is going and knocking on doors and getting people involved and volunteering at your church and filling out food pantries and the best revenge is living well and making a lot of money. So
Yeah.
live in a way that people who hate you are envious of you.
Yeah, well, it's like there's two things I would say. They're both biblical principles. One is so much as it depends on you, be at peace with all people, right? Like you can't be at peace with everyone, right? But so much as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. And the second one, oh, I lost it. The second one is the idea that we like that if we just seek to live a good life and be the good moral people that we need to be, when other people attack us, it will only bring other people. Everybody else will recognize that they're the ones that are in fault because we're actually good people. And so this is what you see happening. I mean, they can firebomb Teslas all they want, but what's the ratings? What's happening in the rating system? I think the people who voted for Trump are not having buyer's remorse. They're like, geez, I'm really glad I did this because look at what they're doing. They're like they're crazy is on display. Like when their approval rating is down to 27%, like that's terrible. That's awful. It's like I just can't even imagine. And so like as we continue to try to do what's good and right, I mean, people are going to see the truth and they're going to for them in some cases. I don't know about Canada, but hopefully they make some good decisions and start and move in a positive direction. But generally speaking, this is the path forward. The path of violence is the path of the left and Antifa and that kind of stuff, not the Republican Party. So yeah. Well, cool. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of I think we should probably wrap up at this point, but if you have anything else that you want to share before we do, and just want to thank you for coming on.
Well, I just want to say that again, I'm down here in New York. I'm a member of the New York Young Republican Club. I'm a member of the Bronx Caucus. I'm proud living here in the Bronx. And, I was going to say, if anyone wants to reach out to, sort of to me, if they're moving to New York, and I know a lot of I've actually met a lot of Mainers who've come down as well. Please get in contact with me. And, I would love to have the opportunity to meet folks. And I hope to be back in Maine once again. It's only a matter of time. I don't know, whatever the opposite of buyer's remorse is, that's what I have about the current Trump administration. Buyer's enthusiasm, in a sense.
There you go. How would people get in touch with you if they wanted to get in touch? Are you on X?
So what the best thing to do would be actually to check out the New York Young Republican Club website, nyyRC.com. My contact details are on there. If you want to send a message right to the club, there's a form you can, sort of reach out to, mention my name. And it is the most fun that I've ever had. Despite New York being such a blue city, or seemingly a blue city, this is trending a lot towards the right. This is the most well-respected, 1,800 members here, a fantastic club and a great way to sort of fight for Republican principles here in New York.
Well, and I have to say, thank you. I know that your plan is to become a U.S. citizen, but you're not, and yet you called and tried to do as much as you possibly humanly could to help help Donald Trump win and sanity to prevail. And so you're proving to be a patriot. Although even if you were from America, Mainers would always consider you to be from away because they have that joke. But anyway, we'll welcome you back, and we'd love to have you here helping to volunteer. But anybody at home, again, to Justin's point, like if you want to help, if you care about our nation and you want to see the state of Maine move in a positive direction, you got to get involved. we talked about this a little earlier in the sense that I don't want to be here doing this. I don't want to be involved in politics. I just want to live my life, work a job, spend time with my friends and family. But ultimately, the radical left is not allowing us to do that. And so we need you. We need people to get involved, to volunteer. There's tons of different things that you can do. We had a meeting recently where somebody talked about how they had people who never came to any meetings, but just let people know that they were available to help with, putting stamps on letters and putting envelopes together to get them sent out. There are tons of things that can be done right from home. But one of the things that you can do, it's one of the easiest things, is there are shorts of this video and other videos that I put out as part of the podcast and other places in social media. And really TikTok's a really important place that we need to get more content into, which I've tried to do. You can follow me there at Muddy Waters ME. I'm there posting videos that I think we can reach the youth with, because I think the biggest way that we're going to reach younger people is by getting these videos and videos like them and creating more digital content to get them out to people. But before I think you can get those out to people, some of it you can just share on TikTok. They have some weird algorithms. I don't know how it works, but I think the bigger thing is we need to have more civil discourse. We need to have conversations with people that we don't 100% agree with, build relationships, and through that, over time, by sharing videos like this and other good videos by things like Turning Point USA. There's some great stuff with Charlie Kirk. You can positively impact. We can actually change people's minds and help them see the truth. The reality is most of the people in our country, in our world, in our state are not at core people who are trying to do evil things. They may be people that are misled and misguided, and they're listening to mainstream media, but they're not, generally speaking, evil people that are trying to harm the world, or at least they don't think they are. And so I think the best path forward on how to reach them is to be friendly, is to be nice, is to build relationships with them, and is to share truth with them. And over time, the more that we speak the truth, as long as we don't have the Cassandra complex, the more people will see the truth and will come over to our side. So get involved, number one, and find ways to contribute, because we can't do this without you. If you like to sit at home and not be involved, I get it, I understand, but we're not going to win if we don't get involved. So thank you all, and we'll be back here on Monday, and I think Alan Servinas is going to be my guest on Monday. Alan Servinas works for Parental Rights and Education Maine, and he's doing a lot of really cool stuff in the school boards. You may remember, if you've been watching, that he was on probably sometime, I think late December. But there's tons of stuff that's been happening over the course of the last year. And so we're going to have a lot more to talk about, and look forward to seeing you all then. And again, thanks for coming on, Justin.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here, Chuck. Take care.
See you guys. Bye.